The Grand Council chamber of the Galactic Coalition stretched 300 meters in every direction. Representatives from 47 different species sat in their designated sections, but today the usual calm discussions were replaced by barely contained panic. Commander Velthar stood at the central podium, his tall frame rigid with stress. The holographic display behind him showed 3 red dots marking dead worlds. Tethys 7 Margrave Colony and New Arcos Prime, Velthar announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive hall. All 3 worlds went silent within 5 days. We sent reconnaissance teams. They found nothing but corpses and empty cities. The chamber erupted in dozens of languages. Representatives shouted questions and demands. High Chancellor Morvath raised his hand for silence, and gradually the noise died down. Morvath had led the coalition for 20 years, guiding them through trade disputes and border conflicts. But this was different. This was extinction-level threat. The Thalkar horde has broken through our outer defense perimeter, Morvath said heavily. Our military command estimates they have over 2 million warriors, possibly more. They do not negotiate. They do not take territory. They simply consume everything in their path and move on. Ambassador Yoon sat in the observer section reserved for newer coalition members. Earth had joined the Galactic Coalition only 3 years ago, and humans were still considered a curiosity by most species. They were shorter than most sentient races, technologically primitive, and came from a world that most galactic citizens considered a death trap. Yet something about this crisis made Yoon pay close attention. "What are our military options?" asked Representative Korvath of the Margrave Systems, his 4 eyes blinking rapidly with stress. Velthar pulled up tactical displays. "We have the 4th, 7th, and 9th fleets positioned along the projected invasion routes. Our ground forces are establishing defensive positions on 12 core worlds. Standard protocol calls for defensive lines, strategic retreats, and civilian evacuations." "How long can we hold?" someone asked. "Unknown. The Thalkar don't fight like any enemy we've encountered. They attack in massive swarms, they use biological weapons, and they adapt quickly. Our casualties are running 3-1 in their favor." Morvath looked around the chamber, seeing fear on faces that had never known true warfare. The coalition had existed for 2,000 years, built on principles of diplomacy and measured military response. Wars were fought with honor, with rules, with the understanding that enemies today might be allies tomorrow. The Thalkar recognized none of these principles. "We need reinforcements," Velthar continued. "But our military academies are designed to produce officers, not mass armies. We haven't fought a total war in 8 centuries. "What about mercenaries?" suggested someone. "We've contacted every major military contractor in coalition space. They're willing to help, but they want guarantees we cannot provide. Many are already evacuating their own worlds." The discussion went in circles for an hour. Various representatives proposed solutions ranging from diplomatic outreach to the Thalkar, which everyone knew was hopeless, to abandoning the outer colonies entirely. Ambassador Yoon listened carefully, making notes but saying nothing. Humans had learned early that speaking too much in coalition meetings led to being dismissed as ignorant primitives. Finally, Representative Solmara of the Vex Collective spoke up. "What about the humans?" The chamber fell silent. Dozens of eyes turned toward the observer section where Yoon sat. Yoon kept his expression neutral, waiting. "The humans?" Velthar looked skeptical. "With respect to Ambassador Yoon, humans have barely achieved faster-than-light travel. Their military technology is centuries behind ours. But they have military experience," Solmara insisted. "We've all read the reports. Earth's history is one continuous war from the moment their species achieved sentience until they reached space. They have more combat experience than any species in the coalition." Morvath considered this. "Ambassador Yoon, would Earth be willing to provide military assistance?" Yoon stood smoothly. "I would need to consult with my government, High Chancellor." "What exactly would you require?" "Soldiers," Velthar said bluntly. "Trained infantry to reinforce our defensive lines. Officers with combat experience to advise our commanders. We can provide transport, weapons, and supplies. We simply need personnel who know how to fight a real war." Yoon nodded slowly. "I will transmit your request immediately. However, I should warn the Council that human military doctrine may differ significantly from coalition standards." "Different how?" asked Morvath. "Humans learned warfare under difficult circumstances. Our methods can be direct and uncompromising. We don't always follow the same rules of engagement that the Coalition prefers. Velthar waved this away. We're facing extinction. I think we can accommodate different tactical approaches. We just need competent soldiers. Very well, Yoon said. I will forward your request to Earth Defense Command. The meeting continued for another hour, discussing logistics and defensive positions. But Yoon was already composing his message to Earth. He chose his words carefully, knowing that how he framed this request would determine Earth's response. 3 days later, Yoon received Earth's reply. He read it twice before calling for an emergency council session. When the representatives gathered, Yoon stood before them with a datapad in hand. Earth has agreed to provide military assistance, he announced. We are dispatching the KSSF Baekdu with a special operations unit under Captain Lee Hyun. Additional forces will follow if needed. How many soldiers? Velthar asked. The initial deployment is 40 personnel. 40? Velthar looked incredulous. We're facing 2 million hostiles and Earth sends 40 soldiers? Special Operations Forces, Yoon corrected. Elite units. Earth Command believes quality is more important than quantity in the early stages. They want to assess the threat level firsthand before committing larger forces. Morvath frowned. Ambassador Yoon, we appreciate Earth's willingness to help, but 40 soldiers will not change the course of this war. Perhaps not, Yoon agreed. But Earth Command asked me to relay a message. They said that if the Council wants human military assistance, they need to understand what that means. Humans don't fight wars the way the Coalition does. We don't fight for territory or political advantage. We fight to win by any means necessary. That sounds ominous, Solmara observed. It's meant as a warning, Yoon said quietly. Earth's military history is not glorious or honorable. It's brutal and effective. If you want human soldiers, you need to be prepared for human methods. Velthar considered this. Outside the chamber, reports were coming in of another colony world going dark. The Thalkar were advancing faster than predicted. We don't have much choice. Tell your people we accept their terms. Send the 40 soldiers. If they prove effective, we'll request more. Yoon nodded and sent the confirmation. Deep down, he wondered if the Council truly understood what they were asking for. He had read Earth's military history. He knew what humans were capable of when they decided something needed to die. The Coalition was about to learn a hard lesson about the difference between soldiers who fought with honor and soldiers who fought to survive. The KSSF Baekdu departed Earth 3 days later, carrying Captain Lee Hyun and his team toward a war zone none of them had seen before. They had their orders, their equipment, and their training. What they didn't have was any intention of following Coalition rules of engagement. They were humans, and humans had learned long ago that the only rule in war was survival. The KSSF Baekdu dropped out of hyperspace 3 light hours from Tethys 7. Captain Lee Hyun stood on the bridge watching the tactical display update with real-time data. His team was assembled in the briefing room below waiting for him. Lee was 34 years old, with a quiet intensity that made people uncomfortable. He had fought in 3 different conflicts on Earth before joining the Space Defense Force, and he carried those experiences in the way he moved and spoke. Captain, we're receiving a transmission from Firebase Tethys, the communications officer reported. Commander Velthar is requesting you proceed directly to the Firebase for briefing and assignment. Acknowledged, Lee replied. He studied the tactical display more carefully. The Firebase was positioned on a plateau overlooking a valley. Strong defensive position, but only one main approach route. That meant any attack would come from a predictable direction. He made a mental note and headed down to brief his team. Lieutenant Choi Mira looked up as Lee entered the briefing room. She was compact and efficient, with hands that could wire explosives or field strip a rifle with equal ease. Next to her sat Sergeant Han Junho, tall and lanky with the patient eyes of someone who could wait motionless for hours. Corporal Kim Dae was cleaning his sidearm, his movements precise and practiced. Private First Class Shin Ara was reviewing medical supplies, her face serious and focused. Listen up, Lee said, pulling up the tactical data on the display. We're heading to Firebase Tethys. The Coalition has defensive positions there. Our job is to assess the Thalkar threat and provide tactical recommendations. Rules of engagement? Han asked. Coalition standard is minimize casualties, attempt to take prisoners, follow honorable combat protocols. Lee paused. Our actual orders from Earth Command are different. Priority 1 is survival of Coalition species. Priority 2 is complete neutralization of hostile forces. Choi smiled slightly. So we do what we need to do. Exactly. But keep it quiet initially. Let's see what we're dealing with first. The Bekdu landed at Firebase Tethys 6 hours later. Commander Velthar was waiting at the landing pad with a dozen officers. He was over 2 meters tall with blue-gray skin and 3-fingered hands. His expression was skeptical as he watched the human team disembark. Lee saluted Coalition style. Captain Lee Hyun reporting as ordered, sir. Velthar returned the salute, looking the humans up and down. They were small compared to his own species, wearing dark combat gear that looked primitive by Coalition standards. Their weapons appeared to be chemical propellant firearms rather than energy weapons. Welcome to Tethys 7, Captain. I hope your journey was comfortable. It was fine, sir. We're ready to receive briefing and begin operations. Velthar led them into the Firebase Command Center. The room was filled with holographic displays showing defensive positions, sensor feeds, and casualty reports. Lee took it all in silently while Velthar began his briefing. The Thalkar are a hive-minded species, Velthar explained. They're controlled by an overmind that coordinates their actions. Individual warriors have limited intelligence but perfect coordination. They attack in massive swarms, usually at night, and they use biological weapons including acid sprayers and explosive organisms. Han raised his hand. What about their command structure? Who's giving orders? The overmind coordinates everything. We haven't been able to identify individual commanders in the field. So if we kill enough of them, the overmind might pull back to preserve forces, Choi asked. Velthar looked surprised. Theoretically, yes, but we've never managed to inflict enough casualties to test that theory. Our defensive doctrine focuses on holding positions and minimizing our own losses. How's that working out? Kim asked quietly. Velthar's expression darkened. Not well. We're losing ground daily. The Thalkar seem to have unlimited numbers. Lee studied the tactical displays. You said they attack at night. What about offensive operations during the day? Offensive operations? Velthar looked confused. Captain, we're barely holding our defensive lines. We don't have resources for offensive action. That's why you're losing, Lee said flatly. You're letting them choose when and where to fight. They attack at night when they have advantage. You defend and take casualties. Repeat until you're dead. The Coalition officers looked offended, but Velthar held up a hand. You have a different approach? We do, but I need to see them in action first. When's the next attack expected? Tonight, almost certainly. They've hit us every night for the past 12 days. Good, my team will observe tonight. Tomorrow we'll discuss tactics. That night, Lee positioned his team along the Firebase walls. The Coalition forces formed their defensive squares according to doctrine, energy rifles charged and ready. Lee watched through his night vision scope as the sun set over the valley. Movement in the valley. Han reported quietly from his position. Lots of it. Lee switched to thermal imaging. The valley floor was alive with heat signatures. Hundreds of Thalkar were advancing in a coordinated wave. They were insect-like creatures, each about the size of a large dog with 6 legs and massive mandibles. Some carried explosive sacs on their backs. Others had acid glands visible along their thoraxes. Here they come, Velthar announced over the command channel. All units hold positions and fire on my command. The Thalkar reached the base of the plateau and began climbing. The Coalition forces opened fire, energy beams cutting through the swarm. Thalkar fell by dozens, but more kept coming. The defensive doctrine was working as designed, maintaining steady fire and preventing breaches. Lee watched for 10 minutes, analyzing the attack pattern. The Thalkar were predictable, following the same approach routes repeatedly. They had no tactical flexibility, just overwhelming numbers. When one line of attack failed, they simply threw more bodies at it. I've seen enough, Lee said quietly on the team channel. Choi, take the west wall. Han, find high ground. Kim, you're with me. Ara, stay on medical standby. Captain, what are you doing? Velthar's voice came over the command channel. You're breaking defensive formation. We're not defending, Commander, Lee replied calmly. We're hunting. Before Velthar could object, Lee vaulted over the wall and dropped into the darkness below. Kim followed immediately. Choi moved to the west wall and began prepping her equipment. Han climbed to the highest tower and set up his rifle. What happened next would be discussed in Coalition military academies for years to come. Lee and Kim moved through the Thalkar swarm like ghosts. Lee's rifle cracked precisely, each shot dropping a Thalkar. But he wasn't just killing them randomly. He was targeting specific creatures, the ones that seemed to coordinate the others. Kim moved beside him, his blade and sidearm working in perfect coordination. When Thalkar rushed at them, they found empty space. When they tried to surround the humans, they found themselves in a kill zone. Choi reached the west wall and began placing charges, not to defend the wall but to create a trap. She wired explosive packages to proximity sensors and scattered them along the Thalkar approach route. When the swarm moved past her position, she triggered the charges. The explosion wasn't large, but it channeled the Thalkar into a narrow corridor where Han was waiting. Han's rifle spoke once every 3 seconds. Each shot was a kill. He wasn't aiming for body mass. He was targeting joints, sensory organs, and explosive sacs. When a Thalkar with explosives died near its companions, the resulting detonation killed dozens more. The coalition forces on the walls stopped firing, staring in disbelief. The humans were fighting in a completely different way. They weren't defending. They were actively destroying the enemy with surgical precision. By the time the sun rose, 300 Thalkar lay dead around the firebase. The usual nightly attack resulted in maybe 50 casualties for the Thalkar and 10 to 15 for the coalition. Tonight, the Thalkar lost 6 times their usual number, while the humans hadn't taken a single injury. Velthar found Lee at dawn, sitting on a pile of Thalkar corpses and cleaning his rifle. "What did you just do?" Velthar asked quietly. Lee looked up. "We fought a war, Commander. Not a defensive action. Not a holding operation, a war. And in war, the objective is to kill the enemy until they stop being a threat. But you ignored all tactical doctrine. You broke formation. You engaged in close quarters. You used explosives in uncontrolled patterns. Your tactical doctrine is designed for honorable combat between civilized species," Lee said, standing up. "The Thalkar aren't civilized. They're predators, and the only way to stop a predator is to become a bigger predator." Velthar was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Earth Command sent only 40 soldiers. Is this what they're all like?" Lee smiled without humor. "Commander, we're the polite ones." 3 weeks after the first battle at Firebase Tethys, reports about the human soldiers spread through coalition military channels like wildfire. The reports were confused and often contradictory. Some called the humans saviors. Others used darker terms. But everyone agreed on one thing. The humans fought differently than any species the coalition had ever encountered. Commander Velthar sent his report to High Chancellor Morvath with a mix of relief and concern. The Thalkar attacks on Firebase Tethys had dropped from nightly assaults to occasional probes. Casualties among coalition forces had fallen by 70%. The humans were effective beyond any reasonable expectation, but their methods troubled him deeply. Captain Lee and his team didn't just fight defensively. Every night they went hunting. They tracked Thalkar swarms back to their staging areas and attacked them there. They set traps using Thalkar body parts, creating psychological warfare effects that shouldn't have worked on hive-minded creatures but somehow did. They moved through the darkness like death itself, never where the enemy expected, always striking at the most vulnerable moment. Morvath called an emergency council session to discuss the human situation. Ambassador Yoon attended, knowing this conversation would be difficult. "The humans are effective," Morvath began carefully. "Perhaps too effective. We're receiving reports that trouble many council members. The humans don't take prisoners. They don't follow standard engagement protocols. They use tactics that some species consider unnecessarily brutal." Yoon stood. "High Chancellor, you requested soldiers who could fight the Thalkar. Earth sent what you asked for. Our methods may seem harsh, but they're producing results." "Results aren't the only consideration," Representative Solmara objected. "We have ethical standards, rules of warfare that civilized species follow. The Thalkar aren't following those rules," Yoon pointed out. "They're eating your citizens. They're destroying entire worlds. You can't fight that kind of enemy with polite tactics." The debate went back and forth for hours. Finally, Morvath made a decision. "We'll continue human involvement, but under closer oversight. We want more soldiers, but they need to understand coalition values." Yoon transmitted the request to Earth. The response came back within hours. Earth was sending major reinforcements. Major Nam Su with a mechanized battalion and Commander Og-1 with an aerospace squadron. The message also included a note from Earth Defense Command that made Yoon wince. It said Earth would send the forces, but oversight would be limited. Human commanders would make tactical decisions in the field. When the reinforcements arrived at Tethys 7 2 weeks later, Belthar met them with mixed feelings. The humans brought impressive equipment including armored vehicles, aerospace fighters, and enough ammunition to fight a prolonged campaign. What worried him was the attitude of the new arrivals. They listened to his briefings politely, asked tactical questions, but showed no interest in coalition rules of engagement. Major Nam Su was a stocky man with scarred hands and eyes that had seen too much combat. He reviewed the tactical situation and proposed something that shocked the coalition officers present. "We need to stop defending and start attacking," Nam said bluntly. "The Thalkar are outbreeding your casualty rates. Every day you sit here, they get stronger. We need to find their breeding centers and destroy them." "That would require deep penetration into enemy territory," Velthar objected. "The casualties would be enormous." "Only if you attack stupidly," Nam replied. "We're not talking about frontal assault. We're talking about surgical strikes using human methods." "What methods?" asked a coalition tactical officer. Captain Lee answered. "Speed, surprise, and overwhelming violence at the point of contact. We don't fight fair. We don't give warnings. We hit them when they're vulnerable and we don't stop until they're dead." The coalition officers looked uncomfortable. Commander Oh Ji-won spoke up for the first time. She was a quiet woman with sharp features and the calm confidence of someone who had flown through impossible situations. "Gentlemen, let me make this clear. You asked Earth for help because you were losing. We came here to win. If you want us to follow coalition doctrine, we'll fail just like you're failing. If you want us to fight our way, we'll end this war. Your choice." Morvath, attending via holographic link, was silent for a long moment. "What exactly are you proposing?" Lee pulled up tactical displays. "Operation Steel Rain. We've identified 7 major Thalkar staging areas based on their attack patterns. Major Nam's mechanized forces will punch through their perimeter here and here, drawing their attention. While they're distracted, my special operations teams will infiltrate their rear areas and locate the breeding centers. Commander O's fighters will provide air cover and strike support." "And then what?" Morvath asked. "We destroy the breeding centers," Lee said simply. "All of them. The Thalkar can't sustain their invasion if they can't produce new warriors." "That's genocide," Solmara said quietly. "No," Lee replied. "Genocide is what the Thalkar are doing to your colonies. This is war. If you want a philosophical debate about the ethics of warfare, we can have that discussion after we save your species from extinction. Right now I need a decision. Do we have authorization or not?" Morvath looked around at the council members present in the holographic conference. He saw fear and doubt on most faces, but he also saw the casualty reports that arrived daily. 3 more colonies had gone dark in the past month. The Thalkar were accelerating their advance. At this rate, they would reach the core worlds within a year. "You have authorization for limited offensive operations," Morvath said finally. "But I want oversight. I want reports. And I want you to minimize unnecessary casualties." Lee nodded, but Yoon noticed he didn't actually agree to the oversight condition. The humans saluted and left to prepare their operation. Operation Steel Rain began 3 days later at dawn. Major Nam's mechanized battalion crashed into Thalkar positions with shocking violence. The armored vehicles weren't designed for elegant warfare. They were designed to break through enemy lines and keep moving. The Thalkar swarmed the vehicles but found themselves unable to stop the advance. Nam's forces punched a corridor 15 kilometers deep into enemy territory. The Thalkar overmind responded exactly as Lee had predicted, redirecting forces to stop the breakthrough. Thousands of Thalkar warriors converged on the mechanized battalion. It looked like the humans had made a fatal mistake, overextending themselves into enemy territory. Then the real attack began. While the Thalkar focused on Nam's forces, Captain Lee and 6 teams of special operations soldiers infiltrated through gaps in the enemy perimeter. They moved fast and quiet, using night vision and thermal imaging to avoid Thalkar patrols. Their objective was 20 kilometers behind enemy lines, a massive breeding complex that coalition intelligence hadn't even known existed. Commander O's fighters screamed overhead, striking Thalkar reinforcements trying to reach the battle zone. She wasn't using precision strikes. She was using saturation bombing, turning entire grid squares into burning craters. Coalition observers watching the drone feeds were horrified by the destruction. but it was undeniably effective. Lee's team reached the breeding complex at midnight. It was a nightmare of biological architecture, massive organic structures pulsing with life. Thousands of Thalkar larvae were visible in translucent sacs. Lee felt a moment of something that might have been pity. These creatures hadn't chosen to be born into a hive mind that knew only conquest. Then he remembered the reports from the colonies. The survivors talking about watching their families consumed alive. The children taken for genetic material. He raised his hand and gave the signal. Lieutenant Choi had spent 2 hours rigging the breeding complex with every explosive she could carry. When she triggered the charges, the complex didn't just explode. It burned with chemical fire that spread through the organic structures like cancer. The Thalkar larvae died by thousands. Lee's team didn't wait to watch. They were already moving to the next target. By dawn, 3 breeding complexes were destroyed. By midday, all 7 were gone. The Thalkar advance suddenly stalled, as the Overmind realized it had lost its ability to reinforce its armies. Major Nam's battalion withdrew in good order, having suffered only light casualties. The Thalkar tried to pursue but found themselves facing Commander O's fighters at every turn. The retreat became a massacre, as human aerospace forces turned the pursuit route into a killing field. When the humans returned to Firebase Tethys, they found the Coalition officers waiting with expressions ranging from awe to horror. Velthar approached Captain Lee, who was covered in dirt and gore. "You destroyed 7 breeding complexes in one night," Velthar said slowly. "The Thalkar won't be able to sustain their offensive now." "That was the idea," Lee replied tiredly. "You killed millions of larvae, creatures that had never fought, never threatened anyone." Lee met Velthar's eyes. "Yes, I did. And I'll do it again if necessary. Those larvae would have grown into warriors that would have killed Coalition citizens. I chose your people over them. If that makes me a monster in your eyes, so be it. But your people are alive because of what we did." Morvath's hologram appeared. "Captain Lee, the Council needs to—" The Thalkar Overmind was ancient and vast, a collective intelligence that had consumed 17 different species over 3,000 years. It had faced resistance before, but always the pattern was the same. Initial defense, gradual retreat, final collapse. The Overmind would adapt to enemy tactics, overwhelm them with numbers, and consume their worlds. It had never failed. Until now. The loss of 7 breeding complexes in a single night was unprecedented. The Overmind analyzed the situation with the cold logic of a predator that had suddenly discovered it was prey. These humans were different. They didn't fight to defend territory. They fought to destroy. They used tactics the Overmind had never encountered, striking at vulnerabilities the Overmind hadn't known it possessed. The Overmind made a decision. The Coalition species could be consumed later. The humans were the immediate threat. They had to be eliminated completely and quickly. Within hours, the Thalkar began redirecting their forces. Swarms that had been advancing on Coalition worlds turned and headed toward human positions. The Overmind calculated that with 70% of its available forces, it could overwhelm the human presence through sheer numbers. The humans were effective, but they were few. Mathematics favored the swarm. At Firebase Tethys, Coalition intelligence detected the movement and panicked. Sensor arrays showed massive Thalkar formations converging from multiple directions. The numbers were staggering. Over 10,000 warriors, including heavy bio-titans that the Thalkar used for siege warfare. Commander Velthar called an emergency meeting. "They're coming for us." "All of them. We need to evacuate immediately." Captain Lee studied the tactical displays calmly. "No evacuation." "Captain, you don't understand the numbers. 10,000 Thalkar warriors plus bio-titans. My analysts predict complete base destruction within 6 hours of first contact." "Your analysts don't understand humans," Major Nam said from his seat. He was eating a ration pack, completely unconcerned with the impending attack. "This is suicide," Velthar insisted. "I'm ordering a full evacuation. We'll fall back to the secondary defense line." Lee looked at Velthar seriously. "Commander, with respect, if you evacuate now, you'll be running for the rest of this war. The Thalkar will chase you from world to world until there's nowhere left to run. This is where we make our stand." "Why here?" "This firebase isn't strategically important. It's not about the firebase," Lee said. "It's about sending a message. The Thalkar think they can overwhelm us with numbers. We need to teach them that numbers don't matter if you use them stupidly." Velthar stared at him. "You want them to attack?" "I'm counting on it," Lee replied with a cold smile. In fact, we've been encouraging it. Over the next 3 days, Lee explained his plan. The valley approaching Firebase Tethys looked like a natural corridor for attack. The Thalkar would see it as advantageous terrain. What they wouldn't see were the thousands of mines, incendiary charges, and chemical weapons that Major Nam's forces had been placing for weeks. "You've been planning this," Velthar said slowly. "The defensive operations, the raids, they were all designed to make the Thalkar angry enough to mass their forces here." "Correct," Lee said. "The Thalkar overmind is intelligent, but it's predictable. It thinks in terms of overwhelming force. We're giving it a target it can't resist in terrain we control." "This is insane," muttered a coalition tactical officer. "This is how humans fight," Commander O said quietly. "We don't react to the enemy. We make the enemy react to us." The Thalkar arrived on the 4th day. Sensor arrays detected them at dawn. A massive wave of creatures covering the valley floor like a living carpet. The biotitans were visible among them, massive beetle-like creatures the size of tanks with acid cannons mounted on their backs. Coalition forces manned the walls, but Lee noticed their hands were shaking. They had never faced an assault of this magnitude. Major Nam positioned his mechanized forces at key points around the perimeter. Commander O had her fighters on standby at a secondary airfield 20 kilometers away. Lee and his special operations team took positions on the highest towers. "All human forces, this is Lee," he transmitted on the command channel. "Enemy is entering the kill zone. Wait for my signal." The Thalkar advanced with terrifying coordination. 10,000 warriors moving as one, directed by the Overmind. They reached the valley floor and began the approach to the firebase. The coalition officers on the walls looked at Lee desperately. "Captain, they're in range. We need to open fire." "Not yet," Lee said calmly. He watched the tactical display, waiting for the perfect moment. The Thalkar were packed tight in the valley now, following the natural terrain features that would lead them straight to the base. "Exactly as planned." "Now," Lee said quietly. The valley exploded. Major Nam had spent 3 days turning the valley into a death trap. Mines detonated in carefully planned sequences. Not random explosions, but coordinated patterns designed to maximize casualties and minimize escape routes. Incendiary charges created walls of fire that channeled the Thalkar into tighter formations. Chemical weapons dispersed as aerosols, attacking the Thalkar respiratory systems. The Thalkar tried to retreat but found their rear blocked by new explosions. They tried to advance but ran into fire barriers. The Biotitans attempted to use their acid cannons to clear paths, but Sergeant Han and his sniper teams targeted their weapons, causing them to explode and kill dozens of warriors around them. Commander O's fighters appeared overhead, not to provide close air support but to seal the trap. They dropped cluster munitions at the valley exits, ensuring nothing escaped. Then they began systematic strafing runs, adding their weapons to the carnage below. The Overmind realized too late that it had made a fundamental error. It had assumed the humans would fight like the coalition species, defending their position and trying to minimize casualties on both sides. Instead, the humans had created a killing field and lured the Thalkar into it deliberately. The Overmind tried to adapt, ordering retreat, but retreat was impossible. The valley had become a furnace. Thalkar burned by thousands. Those that tried to climb the valley walls found themselves targeted by human snipers who never missed. Those that tried to dig underground triggered buried explosives. It took 6 hours. When the fires finally died, 8,000 Thalkar lay dead in the valley. The survivors, fewer than 2,000, scattered in panic. For the first time in the species' history, the Thalkar ran from an enemy. The human casualties numbered 23 soldiers, mostly from coalition forces who had been too close to the perimeter when the explosions began. High Chancellor Morvath arrived at Firebase Tethys the next day. He walked through the base in silence, seeing the exhausted human soldiers and the shell-shocked coalition forces. He stood on the wall and looked down at the valley. The scope of the destruction was beyond anything he had imagined. Velthar met him at the command center. "High Chancellor, the humans have achieved what I thought was impossible. They broke the Thalkar assault." "I see that," Morvath said quietly. "I also see how they did it. Commander, that valley is a mass grave. 8,000 creatures died down there. This wasn't a battle. It was an extermination." "It was war," Captain Lee said from the doorway. He looked exhausted, his uniform still covered in soot and blood. "High Chancellor, with respect, you need to understand something. The Coalition fights wars like games. You have rules, honor, restraint. That's admirable when you're fighting other civilized species, but the Thalkar aren't civilized. They're predators, and predators only understand one language: superior force. What you did today was monstrous, Morvath said. Yes, it was, Lee agreed without hesitation. It was also necessary. Those 8,000 Thalkar would have killed hundreds of thousands of Coalition citizens if we let them leave this valley. We chose to kill them here in a place of our choosing, using tactics they couldn't counter. That's not monstrous. That's intelligent warfare. Where does it end? Morvath asked. When do you stop? Admiral Park's voice came over the communication system. He had arrived in system and was listening to the conversation. It ends when the threat no longer exists, High Chancellor. That's always been Earth's policy. When we go to war, we fight to win completely. We don't fight for territory or political advantage. We fight for survival. But you've reduced yourself to their level, Solmara said, appearing on a holographic link. You're as brutal as the Thalkar. No, Lee said firmly. We're not. The Thalkar kill for conquest and consumption. We kill to protect. We're brutal because mercy to predators means death for the innocent. It's an ugly truth, but it's still truth. Morvath was silent for a long moment, looking out at the Valley of Death. Finally, he spoke. The Council will need time to process what happened here. But I want you to know, Captain Lee, that what you've done has saved countless lives, even if your methods disturb us. I don't need your approval, High Chancellor, Lee said quietly. I need your authorization to finish this war. The Thalkar are wounded now. If we push hard, we can end them permanently. But if you make a stop, if you go back to defensive operations, they'll rebuild, and next time they might be ready for human tactics. What are you proposing? The human fleet assembled in deep space beyond Coalition territory. It wasn't a large fleet by Coalition standards, 40 ships including troop transports, supply vessels, and combat frigates. But what made Coalition observers nervous was the attitude of the humans crewing those ships. They moved with the quiet confidence of people who had already won. Captain Lee stood on the bridge of the KSSF Incheon, the flagship of the assault force. Admiral Park had given him tactical command of the ground operations. The objective was simple in concept, horrifying in execution: penetrate Thalkar home space and neutralize their ability to make war. Captain, we're receiving encrypted transmission from Coalition Command, the communications officer reported. High Chancellor Morvath wants to speak with you. Lee took the call in his ready room. Morvath's holographic image appeared, looking older than Lee remembered. The past months had aged the Chancellor considerably. Captain Lee, I'm calling to confirm your mission parameters. You understand what you're about to do? Yes, High Chancellor. We're going to end the Thalkar threat permanently. The Council is divided on this action. Many members believe we've already gone too far. They fear what humanity is becoming in this war. Lee was quiet for a moment. High Chancellor, we're not becoming anything. We've always been this way. Humanity survived 4 billion years of evolution on a death world. We're the descendants of species that killed megafauna, survived ice ages, and turned apex predators into pets. War is in our nature. The only question is whether we use that nature to protect or to conquer. And which are you doing now? Both, Lee admitted. We're protecting the Coalition by conquering the Thalkar. I won't apologize for that, Morvath sighed. I don't expect you to apologize, Captain. I'm calling to tell you that regardless of what the Council decides, I support this mission. The Thalkar would have destroyed us. You gave us a chance to survive. That matters more than philosophical debates about the nature of warfare. Thank you, High Chancellor. Don't thank me yet. Win this war. Then we'll discuss what comes next. The fleet entered Thalkar space 3 days later. They expected heavy resistance. Instead, they found chaos. The Thalkar overmind was in disarray, trying to coordinate defense of multiple systems simultaneously. The loss of so many warriors in the valley had disrupted its planning. It was thinking reactively now, not strategically. Major Nam's mechanized forces hit the outer system defenses hard. The Thalkar tried to swarm the human ships but found themselves outmatched. Human weapons weren't as elegant as Coalition energy weapons, but they were devastatingly effective. Kinetic kill weapons moving at relativistic speeds, chemical explosives, and focused electromagnetic pulses designed specifically to disrupt Thalkar biosignatures. Commander O's fighters swept ahead of the main fleet, destroying Thalkar defensive positions with precision strikes. She flew like someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear. Her pilots followed her lead, engaging targets that would have made coalition pilots hesitate. The fleet reached the first Thalkar hive world within a week. It was a nightmare planet, covered in organic structures that pulsed with the life of billions of creatures. This was where the Thalkar had originated, where the Overmind had first evolved. Destroying it would cripple the species permanently. Captain Lee led the ground assault personally. His team and 300 additional troops dropped from orbit in assault pods. The Thalkar defenders were ready, but they weren't prepared for human tactics. Lee's forces didn't try to take and hold ground. They moved fast, hitting breeding centers and biofoundries, destroying everything that could support the Thalkar war machine. Lieutenant Choi rigged explosives in the largest hive structure on the planet. It took her 6 hours working under constant attack. When she triggered the charges, the entire structure collapsed, killing thousands of Thalkar larvae and workers. Sergeant Han provided overwatch from a captured Thalkar tower. His rifle cracked steadily, each shot ending a threat before it could reach the demolition teams. He counted his ammunition carefully, knowing that when it ran out he would switch to his sidearm, then his knife, then his hands if necessary. Corporal Kim fought through a warren of Thalkar tunnels, clearing chambers one by one. His movements were efficient and brutal. The Thalkar tried to overwhelm him with numbers, but found that humans could be just as savage as any hive creature when necessary. Private Shinara worked tirelessly to keep the team functional. She treated injuries under fire, administered combat stimulants when soldiers were exhausted, and pulled 3 wounded soldiers out of collapsed tunnels. She never complained, never hesitated, never stopped moving. The assault lasted 3 days. By the end, the hive world was in ruins. The Thalkar Overmind tried to mount a counterattack, but found its coordination breaking down. Too many nodes were destroyed, too many connections severed. The human fleet moved to the second hive world, then the third. Each time the pattern repeated. Overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. No mercy, no hesitation, no second chances. The Thalkar tried to adapt, but found themselves fighting an enemy that evolved tactics faster than they could respond. On the 5th day of the campaign, the Thalkar Overmind did something unprecedented. It attempted communication. The transmission was crude, assembled from stolen coalition technology and biological systems. But the message was clear. The Overmind was requesting negotiation. It offered surrender, treaty, coexistence. It promised to withdraw from coalition space and never return. Admiral Park called a command conference to discuss the offer. The coalition representatives on the call argued for accepting surrender. This was what they had wanted from the beginning, an end to the war without complete extermination. Captain Lee listened to the arguments, then spoke quietly. No. Captain, they're offering surrender, Morvath said. We can end this without more bloodshed. They're offering tactical retreat, Lee corrected. The Overmind is trying to buy time. It'll withdraw, rebuild, and return in 50 years or 100 years. Maybe it'll remember human tactics. Maybe it'll find a counter. But it'll come back because that's what predators do. You can't know that, Solmara objected. Yes, I can. Because humanity was once a predator species too. We remember how it thinks. The Overmind isn't offering peace. It's offering a temporary ceasefire while it adapts to fight us better. So what do you propose? Morvath asked. Lee's expression was cold. We finish this completely. We reduce the Thalkar to scattered remnants that will take millennia to recover, if ever. We make sure they can never threaten the coalition again. That's genocide, someone said. No, Lee replied. Genocide is the systematic destruction of a people because of what they are. This is the neutralization of a threat because of what they do. The Thalkar came to coalition space to consume sentient species. They had their chance at coexistence. They chose predation. Now they face the consequences. Admiral Park backed Lee's position. The captain is correct. If we show mercy now, we condemn future generations to fight this war again. That's not mercy. That's cowardice dressed up as ethics. Morvath was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, Do what you believe is necessary, Captain. The coalition will not interfere. The transmission from the Thalkar Overmind was ignored. The human fleet continued its assault. The final battle took place at the Thalkar core world, where the Overmind's primary consciousness resided. The planet was defended by everything the Thalkar had left, over 500,000 warriors, bio-titans, and organic defense weapons. It should have been an impossible fight for 40 human ships and a few thousand soldiers. But the humans weren't trying to conquer the planet. They were trying to destroy it. Commander O's fighters delivered weapons that the Coalition had never seen before. Not nuclear weapons, which the Coalition had banned centuries ago. Something worse. Biological agents designed specifically to target Thalkar genetics. The weapons spread through the atmosphere like a plague, attacking the biofoundries and hive structures at a cellular level. Major Nam's forces landed on the surface and fought their way to the Overmind's primary node. It was a structure the size of a mountain, pulsing with bioelectrical activity. The Thalkar defended it with suicidal determination, but human tactics broke through every defense. Captain Lee stood before the Overmind's core, a massive organic brain that controlled billions of creatures across dozens of worlds. It was still trying to communicate, sending desperate signals offering anything to survive. Lee activated the charges that Lieutenant Choi had placed throughout the structure. Before he triggered them, he spoke to the Overmind, knowing it could understand. You came to Coalition space believing you were the apex predator. You thought numbers and adaptation would let you consume any species. You were wrong. Humanity spent 4 billion years learning how to be the apex predator on our world. We're very good at it. This is what happens when you mistake our civilization for weakness. This is what happens when you threaten our allies. Remember this if any fragment of you survives. Remember that humanity responds to existential threats with total commitment. He triggered the charges. The Overmind died in fire and violence, its consciousness fragmenting across what remained of the Thalkar species.